In the grand, sprawling, and often tragic saga of the Kennedy family, we know the main characters by heart. There's Jack, the charismatic prince destined for the presidency, Bobby, the intense and brilliant attorney general, and Teddy, the heir who carried the family's political mantle for decades. Their stories have been etched into the American consciousness, tales of triumph, power, and devastating loss. But there is another Kennedy story, one that is quieter, more intimate, and in many ways more heartbreaking. It's the story of the daughter they almost lost twice, once to a forbidden love, and then forever to a cruel twist of fate. Her name was Katherine, but to everyone who knew and loved her, she was simply Kick. She was the rebel debutante, the Kennedy, who broke all the rules. With a spirit as bright and effervescent as champagne, she charmed her way through the highest echelons of British society, only to fall in love with a man who represented everything her family stood against. Her story is not one of political ambition, but of a fierce and passionate heart caught between two worlds. The rigid Catholic traditions of her powerful American family and the titled Protestant aristocracy of her adopted English home. This is the story of the Kennedy they tried to forget, a tale of a forbidden love that defied a dynasty and a vibrant life that was extinguished far too soon. To understand the rebellion of Kick Kennedy, you must first understand the world she was born into. The Kennedy family of the 1920s and 30s was a dynasty in the making, an Irish Catholic clan climbing the slippery rungs of American society with ferocious ambition. The patriarch, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., was a formidable, often ruthless businessman who had amassed a vast fortune. The matriarch, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, was the devoutly Catholic daughter of a Boston mayor, a woman who ran her household with an iron will and an unshakable faith. Together, they raised 9 children in a home that was a curious mix of immense privilege and strict, almost Spartan, discipline. The Kennedy compound in Hyannisport was a world of sailing, touch football, and relentless competition. Joe Sr. instilled in his children, particularly his sons, an all-consuming drive to win, to be the best, to achieve power. But for the Kennedy daughters, Rosemary, Kick, Eunice, Pat, and Jean, the expectations were different. Their role was to be charming, accomplished, and, above all, devout Catholic wives who would marry well within their faith and produce the next generation of Kennedys. Kick, born in 1920, was the 4th child and 2nd daughter. From an early age, it was clear she was cut from a different cloth. While her older sister Rosemary was shy and struggled with developmental disabilities, and her younger sisters were still children, Kick was a firecracker. She was funny, vivacious, and possessed a mischievous streak that often put her at odds with her mother's rigid rules. Her nickname, Kick, was reportedly given to her by her family for her irrepressible energy. She was the jester of the family, the one who could make her often stern father laugh, the one who saw the world not as a series of obligations, but as a grand adventure waiting to happen. In 1938, this adventure began in earnest. Joe Kennedy was appointed the United States ambassador to the court of St. James. James's and the entire Kennedy clan decamped to London. For 18-year-old Kick, it was like stepping into a fairy tale. She was thrust into the glittering, decadent world of the British aristocracy, a society that was, in its final years before the outbreak of war, enjoying a last glorious season of debutante balls, country weekends, and high society events. American debutantes were a novelty in London. In Kick, with her unpretentious American charm, quick wit, and infectious laughter, became an instant sensation. The British press adored her. They called her the most exciting debutante of the season. The English aristocracy, often seen as stuffy and reserved, was completely captivated by this spirited young woman who didn't play by their formal rules. She was a breath of fresh air in a world that was about to be plunged into darkness. It was during this magical sun-drenched season that Kit Kennedy, the good Catholic girl from Boston, would lose her heart to a man and a country that would ultimately force her to choose between her family and her happiness. Among the titled young men of the British aristocracy, one stood out, William Cavendish, the Marquis of Hartington. To his friends and family, he was known simply as Billy. He was the eldest son and heir of the 10th Duke of Devonshire, one of the most powerful and respected noble families in England. The Cavendishes were, in essence, British royalty without the crown. They lived on a sprawling 35,000-acre estate called Chatsworth House, a palace filled with priceless art and centuries of history. Billy was handsome, charming, and possessed a quiet, unassuming manner that belied his lofty position. He was the ultimate insider in a world of ancient titles and inherited privilege. From the moment Kit met Billy, there was an undeniable spark. He was drawn to her wit and vivacity, and she was charmed by his gentle nature and his quintessentially English sense of humor. They began a courtship that quickly blossomed into a deep and passionate love. They spent idyllic weekends at Chatsworth. They danced at London balls, and they fell head over heels for one another. To their friends, they seemed like the perfect couple, a fairy tale romance between the New World and the Old. But there was one insurmountable obstacle: religion. Billy Hartington was a staunch Protestant, an Anglican. His family was the bedrock of the Church of England. The Kennedys were not just Catholic, they were one of America's most prominent Catholic families. Joe Kennedy's political ambitions were deeply tied to his identity as an Irish Catholic, and Rose Kennedy's faith was the unshakable foundation of her entire existence. In her eyes, for one of her children to marry outside the church was not just a social faux pas, it was a mortal sin, an act that would condemn their immortal soul to eternal damnation. As the threat of war in Europe grew, the Kennedy family was forced to leave London. Joe Kennedy's political stance as an isolationist had made him deeply unpopular with the British government, and by 1940, he had resigned his post. Kit was devastated to leave England, and more importantly, to leave Billy. They wrote to each other constantly, their letters filled with declarations of love and the anguish of their separation. Back in the United States, Kit tried to resume her American life, but her heart was in England. She briefly worked as a journalist, a profession that suited her inquisitive and outgoing nature. But as World War II raged across Europe, she felt an overwhelming urge to return. Against her parents' wishes, she joined the American Red Cross, and in 1943, she was posted to London. She had found a way back to the man she loved. London in 1943 was a city under siege. It was a place of blackouts, air raid sirens, and the constant threat of German bombs. But for Kit and Billy, it was also a city of stolen moments of happiness. They rekindled their romance amidst the chaos of the war. But the religious issue remained, a dark cloud hanging over their future. Kit pleaded with her mother in letters, trying to make her understand the depth of her love for Billy. But Rose was unyielding. She wrote back letters filled with dire warnings and Catholic dogma, reminding Kit of her sacred duty to her faith and her family. She even enlisted the help of high-ranking officials in the Vatican to try and dissuade her daughter. The pressure on Kit was immense. She was torn between the two great loves of her life, her family, and the man she wanted to marry. Billy, for his part, was willing to do whatever it took. He even offered to take instruction in the Catholic faith, but the complexities of his position as a future duke made a full conversion impossible. He could not, by law and tradition, raise his heir, the future Duke of Devonshire, as a Catholic. Finally, Kick made a decision. She would defy her mother. In May of 1944, Katherine Kick Kennedy married Billy Hardington in a small, simple civil ceremony at a registry office in Chelsea. The bride wore a pale pink dress and a look of radiant, if defiant, happiness. Of the 9 Kennedy siblings, only her oldest brother, Joe Jr., who was stationed in England with the U.S. Navy, attended the wedding. Her parents sent their regrets. Rose Kennedy saw the marriage not as a cause for celebration, but as a tragedy, the spiritual death of her daughter. The joyous union was, in the eyes of her family, a profound and unforgivable betrayal. For a few precious weeks, Kick Kennedy, now Lady Hardington, experienced a taste of the life she had dreamed of. She was a titled aristocrat, the wife of the man she adored, and the future Duchess of Devonshire. But the shadow of the war was never far away. Just 5 weeks after their wedding, Billy, who was a captain in the Coldstream Guards, was sent to the front lines in France to fight in the aftermath of the D-Day landings. Kick was left to wait, a nervous young bride in a country at war. She tried to keep her spirits up, writing cheerful, loving letters to Billy at the front. But her joy was short-lived. In August of 1944, just 1 month after Billy had left for France, tragedy struck the Kennedy family. Kick's beloved older brother, Joe Jr., the golden boy of the family, the one who had stood by her at her wedding, was killed when his plane exploded during a secret bombing mission over the English Channel. Kick was devastated. She had lost her closest ally in the family, but the cruelest blow was yet to come. Less than a month later, in September of 1944, Kick received a telegram. Billy Hardington, her husband of just 4 months, had been killed in action, shot by a German sniper while leading his men in battle in Belgium. He was 26 years old. In the span of a single month, Kick's world had been shattered. She was a widow at 24, her fairy tale romance transformed into a heartbreaking tragedy. The depth of her grief was profound. She had defied her family, risked her immortal soul according to her mother, all for a love that had been extinguished in an instant. Her English in-laws, the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire, who had initially been hesitant about their son marrying a Catholic American, embraced her completely. They saw in her the same courage and spirit they had admired in their son. They treated her not as an outsider, but as their own daughter, a fellow mourner in their shared, unbearable loss. After the war ended, Kick made the difficult decision to remain in England. It was the country where she had found love, and it was the country where her husband was buried. She felt more at home among the quiet, stoic grief of the British aristocracy than she did in the bustling, ambitious world of the Kennedys. She threw herself into the social life of post-war London, her natural vivacity and charm a welcome antidote to the years of austerity and loss. She became one of the city's most popular hostesses, her apartment a gathering place for politicians, artists, and aristocrats, but her heart was still restless. And it was during this period that she began a new and even more controversial love affair. His name was Peter Fitzwilliam, the 8th Earl Fitzwilliam. He was everything Billy Hardington was not. Where Billy had been gentle and reserved, Peter was a dashing, charismatic, and worldly man. He was a notorious gambler, a lover of racehorses, and a decorated war hero. He was also incredibly wealthy, with a fortune even larger than the Kennedys. And most problematically of all, he was married, though separated from his wife. The relationship between Kick and Peter was passionate and intense. He swept her off her feet, offering her a world of glamour and excitement. But once again, the issue of religion loomed large. Peter, like Billy, was a Protestant, and because he was already married, the only way he could be with Kik was to get a divorce and remarry outside the Catholic Church. For Rose Kennedy, this was a step too far. Marrying a Protestant was one thing. Marrying a divorced Protestant was, in her eyes, an unforgivable sin, a public scandal that would tarnish the Kennedy name and jeopardize the political futures of her sons. The conflict between Kik and her mother, which had been a source of tension for years, now escalated into a full-blown crisis. Kik, who had once been her father's favorite, found herself increasingly isolated from her family. Joe Kennedy Sr., ever the pragmatist, was more concerned with the potential for scandal than with the state of his daughter's soul. He urged her to be discreet, to think of the family's reputation. But Rose's opposition was absolute, rooted in a deep and unshakable religious conviction that, to a modern observer, can seem both tragic and cruel. To understand Rose's position, it's important to see the world through her eyes. She was a woman who had endured unimaginable loss. By this point, she had already lost her eldest son, Joe Jr., and her daughter Rosemary had been effectively lost to the family after a disastrous lobotomy. Her faith was not just a part of her life, it was her shield, her solace, the rigid framework that allowed her to endure her suffering. In her mind, she was not punishing Kik, she was fighting for her. She genuinely believed that if Kik married Peter Fitzwilliam, she would be committing a mortal sin that would lead to her eternal damnation. She was, in her own way, trying to save her daughter. But for Kik, her mother's stance felt like a complete rejection. She was being asked to choose between her own happiness and her family's approval. It was an agonizing position, and it took a heavy toll on her. She loved her family deeply, but she also yearned for a life of her own, for a love that was not dictated by the rigid rules of her mother's faith. There is a poignant and rarely told story that perfectly illustrates the depth of this rift. Kik traveled back to the United States to try and reason with her parents, to plead her case for marrying Peter. The visit was a disaster. Rose refused to budge. The arguments were bitter and painful. According to some accounts, her father, who had once doted on her, now gave her an ultimatum. If she married Peter, the family would be forced to cut her off, both financially and emotionally. She would be disowned, heartbroken, and defiant. Kik returned to England, determined to marry Peter, even if it meant losing her family forever. In May of 1948, she and Peter decided to fly to the south of France for a short vacation, a chance to escape the pressures of London and plan their future together. Her father was also in France at the time, and there was a plan for Kik and Peter to meet with him, perhaps for one last attempt at a reconciliation. On May 13, 1948, Kik and Peter boarded a small 10-seater plane at a London airport. The weather forecast was poor, with reports of thunderstorms over central France. The pilot was advised to take a longer, safer route, but Peter, who was known for his impatience, reportedly urged him to take the more direct but more dangerous route. As the small plane flew into a violent storm over the mountains of the Cevennes region, it was ripped apart by the turbulence. There were no survivors. Katherine "Kik" Kennedy, the vibrant, rebellious heart of the Kennedy family, was dead at the age of 28. The death of Kik Kennedy sent shock waves through 2 continents. In England, she was mourned as Lady Hartington, the beloved young war widow who had brought a spark of American vitality to the staid world of the British aristocracy. Her English in-laws, the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire, were devastated. They claimed her as their own, burying her not in America, but in England, in the Cavendish family plot, in the small village of Edensor, on the grounds of their Chatsworth estate. Her simple headstone bears the inscription, "Joy she gave, joy she has found." But the reaction of her own family was more complex and ultimately more tragic. The news of her death was a devastating blow, another unbearable loss for a family that had already endured so much. But the circumstances of her death, flying with her divorced Protestant lover to plan a marriage that would have caused a public scandal, were a source of deep shame and discomfort, particularly for Rose. In a final, heartbreaking testament to the deep rift that had formed between Kik and her family, only one Kennedy attended her funeral. Her father, Joe Sr. Rose Kennedy, who had traveled across the Atlantic to attend the funerals of her sons, did not go to her daughters. She claimed that she was too overwrought with grief, but many historians believe that her refusal was a final, tragic expression of her disapproval, her inability to reconcile her daughter's choices, even in death. The historical significance of Kik's story lies in the unique window it provides into the private world of the Kennedy dynasty. Her life reveals the immense pressure placed on the Kennedy women, the expectation that their personal desires must always be subservient to the family's political ambitions and religious dictates. Her rebellion was not political, it was personal, a fight for the right to love whomever she chose. In this sense, her story is a timeless one, a poignant exploration of the universal conflict between love and duty, between individual happiness and family obligation. Her life also challenges the monolithic image of the Kennedy clan as a united front. It exposes the deep fissures that existed within the family, particularly the profound ideological and emotional gap between the pragmatic, worldly Joe Sr. and the dogmatically devout Rose. Kik's tragedy was being caught in the crossfire of her parents' competing worldviews. In the end, how do we remember Katherine "Kik" Kennedy? It is easy to see her simply as another victim of the so-called Kennedy curse, another beautiful, vibrant life cut tragically short. But to do so is to miss the essence of who she was. Her life was not merely a prelude to her death, it was a brilliant, defiant, and deeply felt story in its own right. Kik was the Kennedy who chose love over power, passion over politics. In a family where duty was paramount, she dared to follow her heart. She was not a saint, nor was she a simple victim. She was a complex, flawed, and deeply human woman who found herself in an impossible position, caught between the unyielding faith of her mother and the all-consuming love she felt for two men who were deemed unsuitable. Her final act was not one of defiance for defiance's sake. It was a desperate grasp for happiness, a final attempt to build a life of her own, free from the crushing weight of her family's expectations. The tragedy is that she never got the chance to see it through. The image of her lone grave in a quiet English churchyard, far from the Kennedy compound in Massachusetts, is a powerful and poignant symbol of her life. She was the Kennedy who found her home not in America, but in England. She was the daughter who was, in many ways, lost to her family long before that fateful plane crash. Yet, in the hearts of those who knew her in England, and in the quiet dignity of her final resting place, she seems to have found a measure of peace. Her life was a tumultuous journey, but in the end, as her headstone so beautifully suggests, we can only hope that the young woman who gave so much joy to others finally found some for herself. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.